When I was just 8, my mom made me cover up her bulimia from my dad. I lied, bought her laxatives, and cleaned up in minutes. Years later, when she almost died, my parents blamed me, stripped away my privacy, and kept records of my every move to take control of my life through conservatorship. My mother taught me how to lie when I was 8. 7 years later, when her secret almost killed her, they both turned around and blamed me for keeping it. But the real nightmare, the true unraveling of my life, was only just beginning. I still remember the day she made me her accomplice. It was like a switch flipped the moment she realized I was old enough to lie convincingly. Suddenly, I wasn't just her daughter. I was her secret keeper, her shield. She taught me to tell Dad she was showering when she was really purging. She'd give me her credit card, but I had to use my allowance to buy her laxatives so they wouldn't show up on a statement. And the air freshener? I learned specific spray patterns to mask the metallic stench of vomit. I genuinely thought I was protecting her, keeping her safe from Dad's explosive temper. She drilled it into me. He had no patience for weakness, and if he found out, he'd leave us both. "You're such a good girl," she'd whisper on particularly bad nights, her voice weak. "Mommy would be lost without you." By the time I was 10, I could sweep a bathroom clean of all evidence in under 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Think about that. This secret, it consumed my childhood. I memorized her binge cycles. Tuesday nights were the worst, I knew, because Dad had late surgeries. I became an expert at disposing of empty food packages in neighbors' trash cans. Anything to keep them out of our house. If she passed out on the bathroom floor, I'd drag her to bed, then set alarms to check her breathing throughout the night. I missed sleepovers, school events, everything because she might need me. My grades plummeted from pure exhaustion, but who could I tell? She trained me too well. Made me believe that keeping her secret was literally keeping her alive. "If Daddy finds out, my heart will break," she'd plead. "You don't want Mommy to die of a broken heart, do you?" Of course, I tried to convince her to get help. I spent hours at the library researching treatment centers, showing her websites about recovery. One night, I begged her, pleaded with her to get treatment. She gripped my shoulders so hard she left bruises. "This is how I survive," she hissed, her eyes wild. "Without this, I'm nothing. Do you want your mother to be nothing?" After that, I stopped trying to save her. I just focused on keeping her functional, an expert at reading her moods, knowing exactly which days I'd need to cover for her, and which days she could fake normal. Then one day I was 15. Dad and I came home to find her unconscious, lying in a pool of vomit and blood. She'd torn her esophagus. She was hemorrhaging. As paramedics worked frantically around her, Dad turned to me, a dawning horror on his face. "You knew," he breathed, seeing my chilling lack of surprise. "How long have you known?" I couldn't lie anymore. 7 years of secrets just poured out while we waited, not knowing if she would even survive. He didn't say a word, just stared at me like I was a complete stranger. When she finally woke up 3 days later, the first thing she asked was if I'd told. Dad answered for me, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "She told me everything. 7 years, and my own daughter helped you lie to me." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of betrayal. "She was supposed to protect me," she whispered, looking at me. "That's what daughters do." The story she spun for the doctors made me sound like some sort of monster. She claimed I'd enabled her, even encouraged her disorder, hidden it from my poor father, and helped her get sicker because I liked the special attention. She had her evidence too, all the laxatives I'd bought, the lies I'd told, the years I'd kept her secret. No one, not one person, asked why an 8-year-old would choose to enable bulimia. They just saw a teenager who'd hidden her mother's potentially fatal illness for 7 years. Dad believed every single word. It was easier than admitting he'd missed every single sign. The family therapist focused on my codependency issues, not how a child became responsible for an adult's disease. Mom played the victim perfectly, weeping about how I prevented her from getting help sooner. They sent her to inpatient treatment, while I was left to live with my father, who could barely look at me. "She could have died," he said one night, his voice laced with venom. "And it would have been your fault. You're a traitor to this whole family." When Mom came home after 3 months, supposedly cured, she was different. Cold. She'd gained weight in treatment and blamed me for every single pound. 7 years of my life ruined, she'd hiss. Because you couldn't just tell someone. Within a week she started purging again. But now she made sure I knew about it. She'd leave the bathroom door open, leave vomit for me to find, leave empty laxative boxes on my pillow. When I told Dad, he accused me of trying to sabotage her recovery with false accusations. I was trapped in a house with two parents who hated me for opposite reasons. Mom hated me for telling her secret after 7 years. Dad hated me for keeping it that long. Neither of them believed I'd been a child forced into an impossible position. When I turned 18, I thought I was finally free. I could leave. But Mom had one last card to play. The night before I was supposed to leave for college, she took a bottle of pills. Not enough to die, just enough to be hospitalized. She told the doctors I'd driven her to it, that I was abandoning her after creating her dependence on me. Dad pulled me aside at the hospital, his eyes dead. He made things brutally clear. If I left now after driving her to attempt suicide, he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of daughter I was. My college, future employers, everyone. They'd know about the girl who kept her mother's eating disorder secret for 7 years, then abandoned her when she was most vulnerable. So I stayed. I deferred college. I continued living in their house, where Mom made sure I knew exactly how much I'd ruined her life. She purged openly now, leaving messes for me to find like some twisted punishment. Dad pretended not to notice, satisfied that I was paying for my crimes by witnessing what I'd supposedly caused. They had found the perfect revenge, making me watch her slowly destroy herself, while blaming me for both enabling and exposing her. I was 21, sleeping in my childhood bed, cleaning up vomit again. But now, everyone knew it was my fault she was vomiting in the first place. The next morning, I woke to find my bedroom door had been removed from its hinges. Dad stood in the empty doorway, a screwdriver in his hand, his expression cold and methodical. He didn't need to explain. Privacy was a privilege I'd lost along with their trust. Mom appeared behind him, her face gaunt despite the weight gain from treatment. She watched him carry the door away, then turned to me with a smile that never reached her eyes. The message was chillingly clear. They were done pretending this was anything but punishment. I got dressed in that doorless room, feeling their eyes on me from the hallway. When I went to the bathroom, Mom followed, standing outside. When I tried to close that door, she pushed it open. Privacy anywhere had become impossible. At breakfast, they started a new routine. Mom served herself a normal portion, then pushed half onto my plate while Dad watched approvingly. She ate nothing, just moved food around while staring at me. When I tried to leave, Dad blocked my path. I had to sit there and finish every bite while Mom watched, her eyes hollow. The house became a prison of surveillance. They installed a baby monitor in my room, claiming they needed to make sure I wasn't sneaking out to enable Mom's disorder. They removed the lock from the bathroom door. They disconnected my phone, saying I might call someone, and spread lies about our family. I started looking for jobs, desperate for any escape. But every application I filled out mysteriously disappeared. When I confronted Dad, he simply said that someone who'd hidden such a serious illness for 7 years couldn't be trusted with employment. Mom nodded along, adding that my codependency issues made me unemployable anyway. They began tag-teaming their surveillance. When Dad left for work, Mom would follow me room to room, narrating everything I did in a flat monotone. When she went to her therapy appointments, Dad would work from home, positioning himself to watch me at all times. They never ever left me alone in that house. One afternoon, I found Mom in the bathroom with her fingers down her throat. I turned to leave, but she grabbed my wrist with her free hand, forcing me to watch. When she finished, she wiped her mouth and smiled. She didn't clean up. That was my job now. My penance. I started documenting everything in a journal hidden in my mattress. Every incident, every manipulation, every moment of their coordinated torture. Writing helped me remember that this wasn't normal, that I wasn't crazy for thinking their behavior was wrong. Mom found the journal within a week. She didn't take it. Instead, she left it on the kitchen table with certain passages highlighted in yellow. The parts where I'd written about wanting to leave, about their cruelty, about feeling trapped. Dad read it over dinner while I sat frozen. Neither of them said a word, but the message was clear. Even my private thoughts weren't private anymore. They started a new game after that. They'd leave pamphlets around the house, mental health facilities, programs for troubled young adults, involuntary commitment procedures. Never saying anything directly, just leaving them where I'd find them. The threat hung in the air, thick and nauseating like Mom's vomit smell. I tried to reach out to extended family, but Mom had gotten there first. She'd called them all, crying about how I'd hidden her illness and was now trying to sabotage her recovery. My aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, they all believed her version. When I tried to explain, they accused me of being in denial about my role in her sickness. The isolation was complete. No friends, no family, no privacy, no job, no escape. They'd crafted the perfect punishment, forcing me to live with the consequences of a choice I'd been manipulated into making as a child. One night, I overheard them talking in their bedroom. Mom was crying, real tears this time, not the performed ones she used for guilt. She was telling Dad how much weight she'd gained, how disgusting she felt, how it was all my fault for exposing her. Dad comforted her, agreeing that I'd ruined everything, promising they'd make me understand the damage I'd caused. That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just about punishment. They needed me here as their scapegoat. Mom needed someone to blame for her relapse. Dad needed someone to blame for his blindness. Together, they created a narrative where I was the villain, and they were both victims of my childhood betrayal. I started paying closer attention to their patterns. Mom's purging still followed a schedule tied to Dad's work hours, just like before. But now she made sure I witnessed it, made sure I knew she was sick because of me. Dad's anger peaked whenever Mom had a bad day, as if punishing me could somehow fix her. They were feeding off each other's dysfunction, and I was their shared target. Every pound Mom gained or lost, every therapy session that didn't work, every moment of Dad's guilt for not noticing. It all became my fault. They'd found a way to avoid taking any responsibility by placing it all on me. I began to notice something else. They were documenting things too. Dad had a notebook where he recorded every time I upset Mom. Mom kept a calendar, marking her bad days with my supposed triggers. They were building a case, though for what? I didn't know yet. The answer came when I overheard Dad on the phone with someone. Legal conservatorship. They were exploring whether they could gain legal control over me, citing my severe codependency and enabling behaviors as evidence that I couldn't care for myself. The years of documentation would support their case. That night, I lay in my doorless room, staring at the ceiling while the baby monitor's red light blinked at me. They weren't just punishing me for the past. They were ensuring I'd never have a future. If they succeeded, I'd be trapped here forever. Their perpetual scapegoat for a disease that started before I could even write my name. The realization about conservatorship changed everything. I couldn't just wait for an opportunity to escape anymore. I had to act before they trapped me permanently. I started small, testing boundaries. When Mom followed me to the kitchen, I moved faster than usual, forcing her to hurry. She stumbled trying to keep up, knocking over a vase. The crash brought Dad running from his office. He saw the broken pieces and Mom's flustered expression, then turned his anger on me for moving too quickly. But I'd learned something valuable. They weren't invincible. They had weaknesses. Over the following days, I experimented with subtle disruptions. I'd wake up earlier than usual, throwing off their surveillance schedule. I'd spend longer in the bathroom, knowing Mom would grow anxious waiting outside. I'd eat my forced meals painfully slowly, watching Dad's jaw tighten with each deliberate bite. Their reactions taught me more about their dynamic than years of observation ever had. Mom's control depended on predictability. When I disrupted her routines, she became erratic, making mistakes. Dad's authority relied on Mom's stability. When she faltered, he had to compensate, leaving gaps in their coordinated monitoring. I discovered their first major vulnerability by accident. While cleaning Mom's latest mess in the bathroom, I noticed she'd left her therapy notebook on the counter. The pages were filled with lies about me, but also something else. Admissions about her continued purging that directly contradicted what she told her therapist. She'd been documenting her relapses, but blaming them on my presence. Instead of confronting her, I photographed the pages with an old digital camera I'd hidden in my closet. The camera had been a birthday gift from before everything fell apart, forgotten by my parents in their obsession with controlling me. I started documenting everything. Mom's purging schedule, Dad's work absences, the pamphlets they left around, their conversations I overheard. Mom noticed my newfound calmness and grew suspicious. She increased her surveillance, following me even more closely. But this backfired spectacularly. The constant monitoring exhausted her, especially combined with her restricted eating and secret purging. She started making mistakes, leaving evidence of her bulimia in places Dad might find it. I began subtly highlighting these mistakes. When she left vomit residue on the toilet seat, I'd clean everywhere except that spot. When she forgot to flush completely, I'd ensure Dad used that bathroom next. Small things that couldn't be traced back to me, but created friction between them. The strategy worked better than expected. Dad started noticing signs of Mom's relapse that she couldn't blame on me. They argued in hushed tones, each accusing the other of not watching me closely enough. Their united front began showing cracks. During one of Mom's therapy appointments, Dad worked from home as usual, but the previous night's argument had left him distracted. He kept checking his phone, pacing the house, forgetting to maintain his usual vigilant position. I seized the opportunity to search his office. His conservatorship research was extensive legal documents, medical articles, forum posts from parents who'd gained control over adult children. But I also found something unexpected. Emails to Mom's therapist, expressing doubts about my role in her illness. He'd written about timeline inconsistencies, questioning how an 8-year-old could have orchestrated such elaborate deception. The emails were never sent. Each one sat in his drafts folder, typed out then abandoned. Part of him knew the truth but couldn't face it. This knowledge became my weapon. I started leaving subtle reminders of my childhood around the house. An old report card showing my grades before they dropped. A photo of me at age 8, clearly too young to be anyone's enabler. A Mother's Day card I'd made at school, innocent and loving from before I knew her secret. Dad found each item and tried to ignore them. But I saw how his eyes lingered. Mom noticed them too and flew into rages, destroying the evidence of my stolen innocence. But her extreme reactions only highlighted the absurdity of blaming a child. Their relationship deteriorated further. Mom accused Dad of going soft, of forgetting what I'd done to their family. Dad snapped back that maybe they should focus on her recovery instead of punishing me. The arguments grew louder, more frequent, more revealing. One evening, while they fought in their bedroom, I heard Mom admit she'd started purging again the day she came home from treatment. She'd never even tried to recover. Dad's response was explosive. He'd believed her manipulation, turned against his own daughter, all while she'd been lying to him again. The house fell silent after that fight. Dad slept in his office. Mom locked herself in their bedroom for the first time in months. No one watched me, but I didn't try to leave. I knew they'd unite against me if I did. Instead, I used the freedom to prepare. I organized my evidence, photos of Mom's therapy notebook, recordings of their arguments, documentation of their surveillance tactics. I hid copies in multiple locations, including a sealed envelope in the mailbox of our elderly neighbor, who rarely checked her mail. Mom emerged from the bedroom the next morning looking haggard. She found me in the kitchen and stood there swaying slightly. Without Dad's support, her intimidation tactics felt hollow. She tried to reassert control by demanding I make her breakfast, but her hands shook as she pointed at the stove. I complied but moved differently than before. Instead of the careful, submissive motions they trained into me, I cooked with confidence. I hummed while scrambling eggs, smiled while buttering toast. Mom's face twisted with each cheerful gesture. When Dad appeared, unshaven and exhausted, the three of us sat at the table in tense silence. Mom pushed food around her plate while Dad actually ate, breaking their unified front. I finished my meal calmly, then stood to clear the dishes. Mom grabbed my wrist, her nails digging in. But instead of wincing, I looked directly at her and smiled. She jerked back as if burned. Dad watched this interaction with narrowed eyes, seeing our dynamic differently now that their alliance had fractured. Over the following week, I systematically dismantled their control mechanisms. When Mom followed me room to room, I'd lead her on exhausting routes through the house. When Dad tried to monitor me while working, I'd sit perfectly still for hours, doing nothing but staring at the wall until he grew unnerved and left. They tried to reunite against me, but the damage was done. Their arguments had revealed too much. Dad couldn't unknow that Mom had been lying about her recovery. Mom couldn't forget that Dad had doubted her story about my culpability. I exploited every fracture. When Mom left her purging evidence for me to find, I'd clean it, but leave just enough trace for Dad to notice. When Dad made threats about conservatorship, I'd mention how Mom's therapist might react to learning about her ongoing bulimia. The baby monitor in my room became my tool. I'd sit beneath it and talk to myself, describing memories from childhood that highlighted their failures. How Mom had taught me to lie. How Dad had been too busy with work to notice his wife's illness. How they both failed to protect their 8-year-old daughter. I knew they listened to every word, and I crafted each monologue to drive wedges between them. Sometimes I'd wonder aloud why Dad hadn't noticed Mom's obvious symptoms for 7 years. Other times I'd question why Mom chose to blame a child instead of taking responsibility. Their paranoia grew. They started suspecting each other of taking my side. Mom accused Dad of leaving his office door unlocked so I could find his research. Dad suspected Mom of deliberately sabotaging her recovery to maintain control over me. I found Mom's calendar where she tracked her bad days and my supposed triggers. Using her own handwriting style, I added entries on days when I hadn't been home, times when Dad had been alone with her. The additions were subtle but damning, suggesting her relapses had nothing to do with me. When she discovered the altered calendar, Mom's scream echoed through the house. She confronted Dad, accusing him of gaslighting her. He denied it, but she didn't believe him. Their trust, already fragile, shattered completely. The house became a battlefield with 3 separate combatants instead of 2 united against one. We moved around each other like weary animals, each suspicious of the other's motives. Meals became tense negotiations. Simple conversations turned into verbal minefields. I started reclaiming small freedoms. I'd take longer showers without Mom banging on the door. I'd read books in my doorless room without Dad demanding to know what I was reading. They were too busy watching each other to maintain their surveillance of me. One afternoon I overheard Dad on the phone with the lawyer. Not about conservatorship this time, but about divorce. He spoke quietly about Mom's mental health, her refusal to seek real treatment, the toxic environment she'd created. The lawyer apparently asked about me, because Dad's response was revealing. He admitted I'd been caught in the middle of something that wasn't my fault. Mom must have sensed the shift because her behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd purge openly in front of both of us, daring us to react. She'd leave graphic evidence throughout the house. She stopped pretending to eat at all, surviving on water and spite. I responded by cooking elaborate, fragrant meals that filled the house with tempting aromas. I'd eat with exaggerated enjoyment, describing the flavors and textures. Mom would flee to the bathroom while Dad watched me with something like dawning respect. The power dynamic had completely shifted. They'd created a prison for me, but now we were all trapped together. Their plan to control me through unified manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking me, they'd taught me their weaknesses and given me the tools to exploit them. I began leaving the house for short periods, testing whether they'd stop me. The first time I simply walked to the mailbox. Mom watched from the window while Dad stood on the porch. Neither tried to prevent me. The second time I walked to the end of the street. By the third time I made it to the corner store and back without interference. They were too exhausted from fighting each other to maintain my imprisonment. Their carefully constructed narrative about my guilt had collapsed under the weight of their own dysfunction. The conservatorship threat felt hollow now that Dad was considering divorce. But I knew better than to attempt a real escape yet. They might unite against me if I pushed too hard. Instead, I continued my campaign of psychological warfare, using their own tactics against them. Every meal became a performance. Every interaction was calculated to deepen their divide. I started doing things that reminded them of happier times, before the secret consumed our family. I'd play old board games by myself in the living room, humming songs Mom used to sing before her illness took hold. I'd work on jigsaw puzzles Dad and I used to complete together. These activities seemed innocent, but served as painful reminders of what they destroyed. Mom's health deteriorated rapidly. The combination of constant purging and psychological stress took its toll. She fainted during one of her surveillance sessions, collapsing in my doorway. Dad and I carried her to bed, working together for the first time in years. As we positioned her on the pillows, our eyes met over her unconscious form. Something passed between us, an acknowledgement of the absurdity of our situation. When Mom woke, she found Dad and me sitting on opposite sides of her bed, not speaking but united in our vigil. Her eyes darted between us, paranoid and confused. She tried to speak but only managed to croak. Dad gave her water while I adjusted her pillows. Our care wasn't tender, but it was coordinated, and that terrified her more than hostility would have. She recovered enough to resume her activities, but the dynamic had shifted again. Dad and I had discovered we could work together when necessary. We weren't allies, but we were no longer enemies. Mom sensed this change and grew desperate to regain control. She tried to manufacture crises that would force us to take sides. She'd claim I'd stolen her jewelry, then find it in Dad's office. She'd accuse Dad of encouraging my defiance, then blame me for turning him against her. But her manipulations had become transparent, and neither of us took the bait. I learned to play them against each other with increasing sophistication. When Mom left pamphlets about mental health facilities, I'd move them to Dad's briefcase. When Dad printed articles about conservatorship, I'd slip them into Mom's therapy notebook. Each discovered the other's research and assumed betrayal. Their final fight happened on a Tuesday night, traditionally Mom's worst time. She'd been purging for hours while Dad pretended to work in his office. I sat in the living room, visible to both of them, reading a college brochure I'd found in the mail. Mom emerged from the bathroom, saw what I was reading, and lost all control. She grabbed the brochure and tore it to pieces, screaming about ungrateful daughters who abandoned sick mothers. Dad came running, saw the destroyed college materials, and something in him finally snapped. He told Mom she was sick, that she'd always been sick, and that blaming me wouldn't cure her. Mom turned on him, accusing him of enabling my betrayal. They screamed at each other while I sat perfectly still, letting their rage flow around me like water around a stone. The argument escalated until Mom made a fatal mistake. She admitted she'd never intended to recover, that she'd kept purging to punish me, to make sure I could never leave with a clear conscience. Dad's face went white. All his doubts crystallized into certainty. He turned to me and spoke the words I'd waited years to hear. He said I wasn't responsible for Mom's illness, that I'd been a child manipulated and abused, that they'd both failed me catastrophically. Mom wailed and raged, but her power was broken. That night, Dad moved into a hotel. Mom barricaded herself in their bedroom. I slept peacefully in my doorless room for the first time since returning from the hospital. The baby monitor's red light no longer felt like an eye watching me, but like a witness to their destruction. The next morning I woke to silence. No one standing in my doorway, no one following me to the bathroom. I made breakfast for one and ate it slowly, savoring both the food and the freedom. Mom's sobs echoed from behind her locked door, but I felt no compulsion to comfort her. Dad returned that afternoon with legal documents. Not conservatorship papers, but separation agreements. He asked to speak with me privately, and we sat at the kitchen table where so many forced meals had taken place. He apologized haltingly and incompletely, but genuinely. He admitted he'd chosen to believe Mom's lies because it was easier than accepting his own failures. He acknowledged the years of abuse I'd endured, first as Mom's secret keeper, then as their scapegoat. I didn't forgive him. The wounds were too deep, the betrayal too complete. But I listened, and that was more than I'd done in years. He explained his plan to leave, to file for divorce, to seek his own therapy. He offered to help me leave too, to pay for college, to support my independence. Before I could respond, Mom emerged from her room. She looked skeletal, her hair matted, her clothes hanging loose. She saw us talking and her face contorted with rage and fear. She accused us of conspiring against her, of planning to abandon her, but her manipulations had lost their power. Dad didn't rush to comfort her. I didn't scramble to clean up her mess. We sat at the table united, not in love but in exhaustion. While she raged impotently, she tried everything in her arsenal. She threatened suicide. She claimed chest pains. She promised to get real help. She cycled through guilt, rage, self-pity and desperation. But we'd heard it all before. The patterns that had controlled us for years now seemed pathetically transparent. Finally, she played her last card. She called her therapist, claiming I was abusing her, that Dad and I were conspiring to drive her to self-harm. But I prepared for this. I calmly showed Dad the photos of her therapy notebook, the documentation of her lies, the evidence of her continued purging. He took the camera and scrolled through image after image. His face showed a journey through disbelief, recognition, and finally grim determination. When Mom got off the phone, triumphant that her therapist was concerned, Dad simply said he'd be calling the therapist himself with some information. Mom's face crumbled. She realized her final weapon had been turned against her. The therapist she'd manipulated for months was about to learn the truth. Her carefully constructed victim narrative would collapse. She fled to the bathroom, and we heard the familiar sounds of her purging. But this time, neither of us moved to stop her or clean up after her. We sat at the table, two damaged people who'd finally stopped enabling the person who'd damaged us both. That evening, Dad called Mom's therapist and provided a detailed timeline of events, backed up by my documentation. The therapist listened in growing horror as the truth emerged. An 8-year-old child groomed into enabling an eating disorder. Parents who blamed that child for their own failures. Years of psychological torture disguised as justified punishment. Mom tried to interrupt to spin her version, but the evidence was overwhelming. The therapist recommended immediate inpatient treatment, not for bulimia this time, but for comprehensive psychological evaluation. The conservatorship Mom and Dad had planned for me was now being considered for her. Maybe as the reality of her situation sank in, Mom's behavior became increasingly desperate. She cycled between begging for forgiveness and spewing vitriol. She promised to change, then immediately blamed us for destroying her life. She was a drowning person pulling others down, but we'd finally learned not to reach for her. The therapist's recommendation for Mom's evaluation triggered a cascade of events that none of us anticipated. Dad contacted a psychiatric facility that specialized in complex cases, and they agreed to assess Mom within the week. She alternated between manic cleaning sessions and complete catatonia, her body finally rebelling against years of self-destruction. I watched her deterioration with detached fascination. The woman who'd controlled my life through manipulation and guilt had become a shadow, powerless without her carefully constructed narratives. She'd stop mid-purge sometimes, confused about why she was doing it, then resume with mechanical determination. Dad handled the logistics with clinical efficiency. He scheduled evaluations, filled out paperwork, and arranged transportation. We worked around each other in the house like strangers sharing a temporary space. The elaborate surveillance systems they'd installed became monuments to their paranoia. The baby monitor collecting dust, the removed doors leaning against walls. 3 days before Mom's evaluation, she attempted one final manipulation. I found her in the kitchen at dawn, methodically swallowing pills from various bottles. Not enough to cause real harm, she'd learned that lesson, but enough to create drama. I simply watched her performance while making coffee, refusing to provide the panicked reaction she craved. When she realized I wouldn't stop her, she grew frustrated and knocked the bottles to the floor. Pills scattered across the linoleum like confetti. She waited for me to clean them up, to fall back into our old pattern. Instead, I stepped over the mess and took my coffee to the living room. Dad found the pills hours later and didn't even ask what happened. He swept them into a bag and disposed of them without comment. Mom watched from the doorway, realizing her final weapon had become as impotent as all the others. The morning of her evaluation arrived with unexpected calm. Mom dressed herself in the clothes she'd worn to my high school graduation, a desperate attempt to remind us of better times. But the outfit hung loose on her skeletal frame, making her look like a child playing dress-up. I helped Dad load her suitcase into the car, a bitter reversal of when they prevented me from leaving for college. Mom sat in the back seat staring at nothing. As Dad started the engine, she turned to look at me through the window. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear and didn't care to understand. They drove away, and I stood in the driveway until the car disappeared. The house felt different without them. Not peaceful exactly, but neutral, like a battlefield after the armies have moved on. I spent that first day reclaiming space. I retrieved my bedroom door from the garage and struggled to rehang it myself. The hinges were damaged, so it didn't close properly. But having any barrier felt revolutionary. I disconnected the baby monitor and threw it in the trash. I took a 2-hour shower with the bathroom door locked, luxuriating in privacy. Dad called that evening from a hotel near the facility. He explained that Mom's evaluation would take several days, possibly weeks. The doctors had immediately recognized signs of severe personality disorders beyond the eating disorder. He sounded exhausted, but oddly relieved, as if finally having professionals validate the situation lifted years of doubt. I used his absence to search the house thoroughly. In their bedroom closet, I found boxes of documentation they'd compiled about me. Every perceived slight, every instance of defiance, every moment they'd twisted into evidence of my supposed pathology. The sheer volume was staggering. They'd spent more energy documenting my imagined crimes than addressing Mom's actual illness. I built a fire in the backyard fire pit and burned every single page. The smoke carried away years of gaslighting and false accusations. Neighbors probably wondered about the bonfire in broad daylight, but I didn't care. I fed the flames until nothing remained but ash. Among their papers, I'd found something unexpected. My college acceptance letter from 3 years ago, carefully preserved. They'd kept it like a trophy, proof of what they'd stolen from me. I held it up to the light, reading the congratulations I'd never gotten to celebrate. The deadline had long passed, but the letter represented possibilities they tried to destroy. Dad returned after 5 days alone. He moved through the house like a ghost, unsure how to exist without the dynamic that had defined our family for so long. We established an awkward routine, sharing space without sharing lives. He cooked his own meals. I cooked mine. We ate at different times in different rooms. He tried to initiate conversations about the future, about college, about what came next. I wasn't ready for those discussions. Instead, I focused on immediate freedoms, leaving the house whenever I wanted, applying for jobs without interference, reconnecting with the world they'd isolated me from. The first job application I submitted was to a local bookstore. Nothing ambitious, just a starting point. When they called for an interview, I stared at the phone in disbelief. Such a simple thing, a potential job, but it represented autonomy I'd been denied for years. Dad offered to drive me to the interview. I declined and took the bus instead, needing to prove I could navigate the world independently. The interview went well despite my nervousness. The manager seemed puzzled by the gap in my employment history, but I crafted a vague explanation about family obligations that satisfied her curiosity. They offered me the job on the spot. Part-time, minimum wage, nothing spectacular. I accepted immediately. Dad seemed genuinely pleased when I told him, though we both carefully avoided discussing how his actions had delayed this basic milestone by 3 years. Mom's evaluation stretched into a month-long stay. The facility contacted Dad regularly with updates I didn't ask to hear. Her eating disorder was just the visible symptom of deeper issues, personality disorders that had likely existed since before I was born. The therapists were working to unravel years of manipulative behaviors and distorted thinking. I started working at the bookstore, treasuring every mundane aspect of normal employment. Stocking shelves, running the register, helping customers. All of it felt like rebellion against the prison they'd created. My coworkers were mostly college students, and being around people my age highlighted how much I'd missed. One evening, a regular customer mentioned that the local community college had rolling admissions. She taught English there and encouraged me to apply. The idea terrified and thrilled me equally. That night, I researched programs online using the computer without fear of surveillance for the first time in years. Dad noticed me looking at college websites but said nothing. We developed a careful dance of avoidance, sharing space without acknowledging the years of damage between us. He'd started seeing his own therapist, disappearing twice a week for appointments he never discussed. The house began to feel less like a crime scene and more like a transitional space. I'd saved enough from my bookstore job to buy a cheap laptop, which I used to complete college applications in my newly private room. Each essay question about overcoming challenges felt like a cosmic joke, but I crafted responses that hinted at difficulties without revealing the full truth. Mom's facility called to arrange a family session. Dad asked if I wanted to participate. I declined without hesitation. He attended alone and returned looking haggard. Whatever happened in that session prompted him to accelerate the divorce proceedings he'd started. I received my first college acceptance email while shelving romance novels at work. Community college wasn't prestigious, but the acceptance felt like a victory. I'd be starting with remedial classes to make up for my disrupted education, but it was forward movement after years of stagnation. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a process server who seemed confused by the mundane suburban setting. Dad signed them immediately and left them on the kitchen counter for me to see. Mom would be served at the facility. The dissolution of their marriage felt anticlimactic after everything that had preceded it. I registered for classes, choosing a light schedule I could manage while working. General education requirements mostly English, math, history, nothing that would set the world on fire. But each course represented progress they tried to prevent. Dad offered to pay my tuition. I accepted, viewing it as partial restitution rather than generosity. My first day of classes arrived in late spring. I packed a backpack with fresh notebooks and pens, feeling simultaneously too old and too young for this milestone. Dad was at work when I left, sparing us both an awkward farewell. I caught the bus to campus, joining streams of students who took their freedom for granted. The classes were challenging after years away from formal education, but I threw myself into the work. Being surrounded by people pursuing goals, planning futures, living normal lives, it was intoxicating. I made a few casual friends, careful not to reveal too much about my past. Mom completed her initial treatment and moved to a long-term care facility. Dad forwarded me the information, but I had no intention of visiting. She sent letters through him. Pages of rambling apologies mixed with subtle blame. I threw them away unread. Her words had lost their power to wound or manipulate. Summer arrived with a heat wave that made the house feel suffocating. Dad announced he'd found an apartment closer to his work. The house would be sold as part of the divorce settlement. He offered to let me stay until I found my own place, but we both knew it was time for complete separation. I increased my hours at the bookstore and started searching for rooms to rent near campus. The independence I'd craved for so long was finally within reach, funded by minimum wage and student loans rather than parental support. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The day I moved out, Dad helped me load my few possessions into a borrowed car. We worked in silence, both understanding this was the end of something that had been broken long before Mom's illness became visible. As I drove away, I saw him standing in the driveway where I'd stood months earlier, watching until I disappeared around the corner. My new room was tiny, just a bed, a desk, and a shared bathroom down the hall. But when I closed the door, it stayed closed. When I locked it, it stayed locked. I sat on the narrow bed surrounded by boxes and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. That night, I lay in my own space, paid for with my own money, preparing for classes I'd chosen myself. The journey from that doorless room to this modest freedom had been brutal, but I'd survived it. Mom remained in treatment. Dad lived alone with his guilt. And I finally had the chance to discover who I might have been if they hadn't stolen those years. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but mine to shape. I had no family to rely on, no safety net to catch me, but also no one to blame for my choices going forward. The girl who'd been forced to enable her mother's illness at 8, who had been blamed and punished and nearly broken, was finally free to write her own story. I opened my laptop and began typing an essay for English class. The assignment was to write about a defining moment in our lives. As my fingers moved across the keys, I realized I had too many defining moments to choose from. So I wrote about this one. The quiet evening in a rented room where a 21-year-old woman finally began her life.